Okay, on today's episode of Studio Knowledge, we're talking my favorite plugins. So before we get started, here's my disclaimer. I'm not favoring any company over another company. I'm not affiliated with any plugin company. I was a beta tester for a specific plugin company at one point, but I'm no longer. And this is kind of like the desert island. I can only take one of these, even though it's all digital. I'm only picking one, and for each category. Okay, and I have my iPad, so I don't make sure I don't skip over anyone. So I have a favorite plugin for console emulations, tape machine, an EQ, compressor, reverb, delay, a guitar amp simulation, bass amp simulation, drums, pitch correction, and just an overall utility plugin. Okay, so I always like to make sure I have plenty of options. So if I say like my favorite EQ is this, it's the one that I reach for either first or most often, and I usually have at least three. Well, with EQs I have probably 6 or 7 that I like to have in my back pocket. But for this purpose, I'm only going for the number one thing. Okay, so first and foremost, let's start with console emulation. And the reason why I put this first is because this is the very first thing that goes on my tracks when I'm mixing. I grew up with mixing on an actual console. It's kind of the starting place when I'm mixing in the analog world. I want the same thing in the digital world. And the one for my ear and for money is the Slate Digital Virtual Console, the VCC. Okay, and usually, depending on the style of music, I normally will use the SSL E series. Again, the style of the music, I might switch to an API console or a Neve console. Okay. As far as tape machines go, again, I'm used to running a tape machine. Thank goodness I don't have to cut tape anymore, or it's been a while. I don't have to seek up multiple tape machines, but I still want that sound. And when it comes to plugins, for me, it's not enough to just sound like a certain plugin or a certain analog gear. I want it to actually behave as if I'm actually using that piece of gear. So with that said, again, for my money, it's the Slate Virtual Tape Machine. Okay. I like that I can change speeds. I like that I can change tapes. I can change the bias, and it just works out for me. I like the VTM. Okay. EQs. The very first EQ, and again, we're talking mixing mainly, because when I'm tracking, I do run my instruments through EQs and compressors, and I try to commit to a sound. But just for mixing, I try to use the same EQs all the way through, because I want to basically behave as if I'm mixing on a console, and I want to have a cohesive sound. That's what I'm going for. So with that said, I like the SSL emulation plugins. I've used the Waves for so long, but now more kind of out of convenience, I use the Slate EQ. It's their SSL series that's in the virtual mix rack. Okay. Compressors. The number one compressor that I like to use mixing is kind of the Swiss Army knife, is the 1176. Again, I use the Waves, Crystal Algae, the CLA 76. But one of the benefits, again, I'm using now the Slate 1176 emulation. I know this sounds like I'm in love with Steven Slate's plugins, and I am. I love them. But one of the big difference that I like using the Virtual Mix Racks 1176 is because there's a knob where I can have 100% of the compression, yeah. Or I can dial it back. And what that allows me to do is kind of do parallel compression without having to set up another compressor. And it's also nice to kind of put it in the virtual mix rack in a chain without having to do a virtual mix rack and then put 1176 and then another virtual mix rack plug in underneath it. It just helps with track count and not having so much and not using so much space. Native power, computer power, all that stuff. So there you go. Reverbs. And I like using the Altiverb, okay? Not a Steven Slate plugin. Now the Altiverb, it uses impulse responses. And one of the reasons why impulse responses are so important to me is, again, I want plugins to behave as if I'm using it in real life. And impulse responses will actually measure the room or the reverb chamber, and it will behave in the way as if, at least as close to my ear as possible, as if I'm recording in those actual rooms. And why is this important? When you just have digital reverb, what happens is that whatever signal you're sending through it, it's going to replicate everything, all the frequencies, all the bandwidth going through there. It's going to basically elongate, create a tail of all those frequencies. And yes, that is good, but one of the reasons why reverb chambers and rooms work so well is because the sound is actually bouncing off all the different surfaces, and it kind of naturally cleans up the sound because it makes the more pleasing sounds heighten, amplify, and kind of the negative octave, or not octaves, the harmonics kind of dissipate. This is why people sound so good singing in the shower or singing in a big bathroom that's really like all tile and stuff like that. It actually makes it more pleasing. So that's why I like the Altiverb and other impulse responsive reverbs, but that's why I like it. Delays. I like using the Waves H delay. I like using delay. I like using slap. I like using quarter. I like using ping pong. But I also like having some grit to it. And I like being able to roll out the highs and lows, because when I have a delay and I don't want to be the exact carbon copy of whatever is playing, I want to kind of have the tail just underneath like a vocal. Like I want to not be a perfect echo. I want to kind of be a little more muted or a lot less clear, so that way the line, whatever line they're singing, can kind of ring out instead of just being, again, kind of an annoying loop, if that makes sense. Guitar amp simulations. This one's kind of tough because I actually like to break this up in two ways. I really like Bias's amp, Positive Grid's Bias amp. I love all their amplifiers, but what I'll do is actually I bypass the cabinet just because I want more cabinets and more microphone options. And so I'll actually send it to Torpedo Sound's Walla Sound, or excuse me, two-tone. See, this is why I wrote it down. Two notes Walla Sound. And that has a lot of impulse responses of guitar amplifiers and a lot of different microphones. And it allows me to actually move the microphone and to actually add as many cabinets as I want and as many microphones as I need. I don't know what the max is, but usually I don't need more than 8, I think. And really 4. That's about as much as I need. So I like Bias amp and Walla Sound to kind of get my guitar sound. For bass guitar, I like IK Multimedia's Ampeg bass amps. But again, I use that plugin for the bass amps, and then I'll use Walla Sound for their cabinets and speaker emulations and microphones for just more options, okay? To really dial in my sound. Drums, I've been using BFD Drums since BFD 2 came out. Real happy with not only being able to shape how the drums are and split out the individual microphones. But also, I like knowing what microphones were used, and I like how clean they are. Yes, they do go through a preamp, but it still allows me to drive a preamp if I need to, if I want some more grit to the sound. It just gives me flexibility, and I really like the sounds. And I've used other ones, but again, I'll give you a full list in the description and a link to the website where I list out my top 3 plugins for all these things. But right now we're just talking about Desert Island. I can only take one. Pitch correction. I'm an auto-tune guy. Now I'm not a pop star auto-tune everything and make it perfect, but for when I do need pitch correction, I'll use auto-tune mainly on vocals and bass guitars. Basses are hard to keep in tune, and that's one that I like using to where it doesn't sound kind of that hollow sound. I like auto-tune. And last but not least, my utility plugin of choice is I like using Sound Radix Auto Line. And this is great for, figuring out what things are in phase, or actually how to get things more in phase. When instruments are in phase, you're not fighting with them with excessive amounts of EQ, because what ends up being sacrificed if something's out of phase is the low end. And the way you combat that is, you're driving a lot of low end to overcompensate, and it's never going to quite fit or work out. And a simple thing is to get the phase alignment just right. So those are my favorite plugins. I want to know which ones you agree with, which ones I'm missing you think I should have on my list. And again, I'll have a full list of all my favorite plugins in the article on the website. So again, and the reason why I have this list is because I used to have just about every plugin under the sun, as many as I could, and it just got to a point where I would go to click an EQ and I just had this long list, and I had a hard time finding things. So I really tried to simplify my life and my mixing, and really found which ones are my go-to, and these are my number ones that I go to first, and then I have always 3 or 4 backup plans in case that's just not working for the song. So I hope this helps, and we'll talk again soon.